This is a homeschool e-learning lesson helping you understand the transactional writing tasks that appear in Section B of Paper 2 of the Edxcel 9-1 GCSE in English Language. Before you begin doing the end of unit assessment for the transactional writing unit, it's useful to become familiar with the way the transactional writing tasks are presented on the actual exam papers, because the way they're presented, the wording of them and the way they look is going to be the same whichever exam series you actually sit your exams in. So in this short tutorial I'm going to take you through transactional writing tasks as they're presented on an actual exemplar exam paper from Edxcel, and explain the things you need to know when you're looking at these in the exam. On your screen you can see Section B, the transactional writing section of a paper 2. This is what it will look like when you turn to it in the exam paper. It will always look like this, and you can see that you've got two separate transactional writing tasks on there. Really important, at the top it says answer one question. You must choose one or the other of these questions. As it tells you, you have 45 minutes, and that 45 minutes includes planning time, and it is intended to be spent on one of these tasks. If you look at the marks, you can see that they are worth 40 marks. So the transactional writing task is worth 40 marks. That is a lot of marks, and that is because they are looking for an extended, well-structured, well-crafted piece of transactional writing that shows your ability to adapt your writing to suit the particular subject, purpose, audience and form that is set in these tasks. So you always get the instruction at the top that you are to answer one question and that you should spend 45 minutes on this section, and that includes the planning time. So let's take a closer look now at these transactional writing tasks. Okay, so if we look at the first task on this section of the paper, we can see that you're given the main task, which is to write the text for a speech you will give to your peers giving essential advice on personal safety. That's where you need to look to be identifying the SPAF of these tasks. That's where most of that information will be held. So if we look at this one, the subject matter is personal safety. The purpose is to give advice. The audience are people like you, so your peers, it means your age group, the people that are most like you, so you will adapt your writing to suit that particular group. And the form is a speech. That suggests that it's more formal than something like a talk or a presentation, so you would be expected to use slightly more formal language in there. So from that main question we've been able to identify the subject, the purpose, the audience and the form. Underneath the main question you are given 3 bullet points to help you get started. You do not have to cover these bullet points in your response if you don't want to. They're there to help you. Okay, if you get stuck, if you really can't think of how to write about this subject matter, you can use those to help you structure your response, but you are not required to cover those. Sometimes we find that the audience or the purpose is stated in these bullet points, so do read through those bullet points if you're unclear about who you're writing for or what the purpose of your writing is. Underneath those you can see this comment as well as any other ideas you might have. If you think back to the work you did in the generating ideas section of this unit, you'll remember that you were told that you can generate ideas from the 2 non-fiction texts that were on the paper, and also your own knowledge of the subject matter, and of course your knowledge and your understanding of the correct conventions to use for the purpose and the right kind of language to use for your audience and your form. The other important thing to note here is that your response will be marked for the accurate and appropriate use of vocabulary, by which they mean vocabulary that is suited to your audience, that is appropriate for the subject matter, so they're looking for specialist, subject specialist vocabulary, and they're looking for vocabulary that is sophisticated. They want to see your command of the English language. It's also being marked for spelling, punctuation and grammar. The spelling, punctuation and grammar mark is actually worth 20% of the total mark that you get for your response to this transactional writing task. So you need to be as accurate as you possibly can. If you do make a mistake, it's fine to cross it out, but make sure that you write a correction above it or next to it or somewhere where the examiner can identify it. The reason for that is that if you don't, the examiners must mark the incorrect word that you've put there. If there's no correction, they have to mark the incorrect one. So make sure you provide a corrected word or phrase if you make a mistake. Now, these transactional writing tasks will always be thematically linked to the two non-fiction texts that you've dealt with in the reading section, in section A of paper 2. So let's look now at how these transactional writing tasks are thematically linked to the reading texts that were in section A of this particular paper. Okay, for the purposes of this short tutorial, I've put the text side by side so that we can look at them quite easily. We have text 1 and text 2. Now these would have been the two texts that you'd have dealt with in the first part of this paper. You've now come to the transactional writing tasks, and the themes of those tasks are linked to these texts. So if we take text 1, we're told it's an extract from 127 Hours Between a Rock and a Hard Place by Aaron Ralston. It's a modern text, and he is an American climber. Ralston goes hiking and climbing in a canyon. Whilst climbing down a narrow canyon, a boulder crushed his right hand against the canyon wall. He had not informed anyone of his hiking plans. Now, obviously there's a link there with the subject of that first transactional writing task, because you're being asked to give advice on personal safety, and you may draw on this idea of telling people where you're going and what you're doing as a way of keeping safe. Okay, so that's text 1. So there are some sort of key ideas that you can take out of there, and you might look through and find some other bits of information in there that you could use in giving your advice. If we turn to text 2, again, this is about an adventurer, about an explorer, but this time it's an extract from Return of Shackleton from Weddell Sea by the American Geographical Society in 1916. So this is a much older text, and it tells us that this is an extract from a journal, the Geographical Review, about Sir Ernest Shackleton's return from his attempt to cross the Antarctic. The journal gives details of his return after his ship Endurance sank. So again, you can see how you could use information in here to construct a speech for a modern audience of people like you about personal safety. So when we're talking about using these non-fiction texts as source material, what we are not talking about is quoting from them or summarising them. That's not what you're supposed to do with the transactional writing task. You must never quote from these texts in the transactional writing task. You can take the ideas, you can take some of the information, and you can transform that into your own words, into your own way of expressing that in your transactional writing task. Let's go back now and look at the second transactional writing task that you could have chosen to do on this paper and see how that links to these two texts in terms of the theme of that task. Okay, so if you got to section B on this paper and you looked at question 8 and you thought, oh, I don't really fancy having to write a speech, I'm not very good at writing speeches, you might choose to do question 9. And question 9 asks you to write an article for a magazine about an interesting hobby or activity. Now again, you can see the link there in terms of the theme to the two non-fiction texts. So Aaron Ralston was a climber, he goes climbing, that's his hobby. Ernest Shackleton was an explorer, his activity was trying to cross the Antarctic. So you can see the link there. In terms of the subject, the purpose, the audience and the form, the subject matter is obviously a hobby or activity, so there's your thematic link. The purpose is to inform and to explain, and the audience is not specified, so you could choose that audience. You might decide that you're going to use the two non-fiction texts quite a lot for your inspiration for this, and you might decide that this article is actually going to appear in a climbing magazine or an extreme sports magazine, and therefore you can use lots of technical vocabulary that you might be able to pick up from those two non-fiction texts to appeal to your target audience, who are people who have an existing interest knowledge and expertise in the area of climbing or extreme sports. So think carefully about how you do this. They're looking for original responses, so it does leave it open to you to decide sometimes who the audience is going to be for that. So let's take a step back then and look once again at how these transactional writing tasks are presented to you on the exam paper and sum up the key points about responding effectively to them. So when you get to section B of paper 2, you will see something very much like this. It will say section B, transactional writing. It will tell you to answer one question. Remember, you only answer one, you must make a choice here. And you should spend 45 minutes on this section. That does include planning. You must make sure you create a plan, otherwise your writing won't be meeting the requirements of the subject, the purpose, the audience and the form. It is worth 40 marks, so it needs to be extended, it needs to be developed and sustained and well crafted. Okay, and the first thing you do is to identify the subject, the purpose, the audience and the form, and then create your plan. So that's what the transactional writing task looked like on the actual exam paper. You are now ready to move on and do the end of unit assessment for the transactional writing unit.